The British soldier's hands trembled as he lifted the German machine gun from the sand-scarred position near El Alamein, November 1942. The desert wind carried acrid smoke from recent combat, but what caught Sergeant James Henderson's attention wasn't the smell of cordite or the heat shimmering off North African dunes. It was the weight of this weapon, lighter than expected, and the distinctive perforated barrel that seemed to mock every assumption British infantry had made about firepower. Within hours, weapons specialists would clock this captured MG42 at 1,200 rounds per minute, a rate of fire that dwarfed anything in the British arsenal. The Bren gun, Britain's standard light machine gun and source of considerable pride among Commonwealth forces, managed a respectable 500 rounds per minute. The Vickers heavy machine gun, backbone of British sustained fire doctrine since the First World War, delivered 450 rounds per minute, with metronomic reliability. This German weapon fired more than twice as fast as either British gun, and it weighed less than the Bren, while matching the Vickers in sustained fire capability. The implications would shake British small arms doctrine to its foundations. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of how British forces discovered the MG42's devastating superiority begins not in the desert, but in the trenches of the First World War, where two nations drew radically different conclusions from the same brutal experience. Both Britain and Germany recognized that machine guns had transformed infantry combat into a struggle for sustained suppressive fire. Both nations invested heavily in developing weapons that could dominate the battlefield through concentrated automatic fire. But the philosophical approaches they adopted diverged so fundamentally that by 1942, German infantry squads built around a single machine gun could generate more firepower than entire British platoons equipped with multiple weapons. The gap wasn't marginal, it was catastrophic, and British soldiers were dying because of it. Britain emerged from the First World War with profound respect for the Vickers machine gun, a water-cooled weapon that had proven capable of firing continuously for hours without failure. There are documented instances of Vickers guns firing over 1 million rounds during extended battles with only routine maintenance. At the Battle of High Wood in August 1916, a single Vickers gun fired continuously for 12 hours, expending 100 boxes of ammunition totaling 100,000 rounds. The gun remained operational throughout, requiring only water replenishment and barrel cleaning during brief pauses. This extraordinary reliability created a belief among British military planners that sustained fire capability required heavy, robust construction with elaborate cooling systems. The Vickers weighed 40 pounds without its tripod, another 50 pounds of steel that provided the stable platform necessary for accurate long-range fire. Adding water for the cooling jacket, ammunition, and the spare parts that accompanied the weapon brought the total combat load to well over 100 pounds, requiring a crew of at least 3 men to transport and operate effectively. This weight seemed justified by the weapon's reliability and sustained fire capability. British doctrine treated the Vickers as semi-permanent defensive armament, positioned in carefully prepared emplacements where its weight didn't matter and its reliability could be fully exploited. The gun could fire for extended periods, delivering precisely controlled long-range fire that dominated approaches and denied terrain to attacking forces. Vickers sections became the anchor of British defensive positions, with infantry sections positioned to protect the guns, while they provided the firepower that actually stopped enemy attacks. The system worked brilliantly in the static warfare of the Western Front, where positions changed slowly, and machine gun crews had time to prepare proper emplacements with overhead cover, ammunition, storage, and carefully calculated fields of fire. The Vickers became so associated with reliable, sustained fire that British planners couldn't imagine replacing it with anything lighter or more mobile. For mobile infantry operations, Britain developed the Bren gun, adopted in 1937 and named for Brno, where the original Czech design was created, and Enfield, where British production occurred. The Bren represented a completely different philosophy, a light machine gun that individual soldiers could carry and fire from various positions without requiring a dedicated crew. Weighing 23 pounds loaded, the Bren could be operated effectively by a single gunner with an assistant carrying spare magazines and a barrel for replacement when the first became too hot. The weapon fired standard British 303-inch rifle ammunition from 30-round box magazines at a rate of 500 rounds per minute, though practical sustained fire rates were considerably lower because magazine changes required several seconds and couldn't be performed while maintaining fire. Each magazine change created a pause in fire, a gap that alert enemies could exploit to move or return fire effectively. The Bren was remarkably accurate for a light machine gun, capable of semi-automatic fire, that allowed gunners to engage individual targets with precision unusual in automatic weapons. British doctrine emphasized this accuracy, training Bren gunners to fire short bursts aimed at specific targets rather than the sustained, suppressive fire that characterized heavy machine gun employment. The weapon's top-mounted magazine, while making it distinctively recognizable and somewhat awkward to fire from prone positions, allowed gunners to observe rounds feeding and immediately identify any malfunction. Reliability was excellent, with the Bren functioning in desert sand, jungle humidity, Arctic cold, and European mud with minimal maintenance. Soldiers loved the Bren for its dependability and accuracy. It became one of the most respected weapons in British service, continuing in use long after the Second World War ended. But the Bren had a fundamental limitation that British doctrine never adequately addressed. It couldn't sustain fire at rates sufficient to suppress German infantry equipped with weapons firing twice as fast. A Bren gunner changing magazines every few seconds couldn't maintain the continuous stream of fire necessary to keep enemy soldiers pinned down. German infantry learned quickly that Bren guns fell silent regularly, providing brief windows when movement was possible, and return fire could be directed at exposed British positions. The magazine-fed design that made the Bren accurate and reliable also made it inadequate for the sustained suppressive fire role that dominated modern infantry combat. British infantry sections discovered this harsh reality repeatedly in France, North Africa, Italy, and Northwest Europe, finding themselves outgunned by German squads built around a weapon system they initially didn't understand. Germany drew different lessons from First World War experience. German doctrine evolved toward a concept called Einheitsmaschinengewehr, or universal machine gun, a single weapon that could function effectively as both a light machine gun carried by infantry and a heavy machine gun mounted on a tripod for sustained fire missions. This approach promised significant advantages. Logistics would be simplified, because only one weapon needed spare parts, ammunition, and specialized training. Tactics would be more flexible, because the same weapon could be quickly adapted to different roles. Production would be more efficient because factories could focus on a single design rather than maintaining separate production lines for light and heavy weapons. The challenge was creating a weapon light enough for individual soldiers to carry and employ effectively, yet robust enough to sustain the high rates of fire necessary for suppressive fire missions that pinned enemy forces while friendly infantry maneuvered. The first attempt at this universal machine gun concept was the MG42, adopted in 1934 and representing a revolutionary advance in machine gun design. Weighing 26 pounds, only slightly heavier than the Bren, the MG42 fired at 800 to 900 rounds per minute from belted ammunition that eliminated the magazine change pauses that limited the Bren's effectiveness. The weapon could be fired from a bipod by a single soldier or mounted on a tripod for sustained fire missions, where it functioned as effectively as much heavier weapons. The barrel could be changed rapidly without tools, allowing sustained fire to continue indefinitely as long as ammunition and spare barrels remained available. German doctrine organized infantry squads around the machine gun, with riflemen serving primarily to protect the gun and feed it ammunition. The squad moved where the gun could be most effective, fought to positions where the gun could dominate terrain, and concentrated its effort on keeping the gun operational and supplied. This machine gun-centered squad organization reversed British doctrine, where machine guns supported riflemen rather than the other way around. The German approach concentrated firepower, allowing a single squad to generate fire volumes that required multiple British sections to match. But the MG44, despite its revolutionary design, had significant weaknesses that limited its effectiveness. The weapon required precision manufacturing with tight tolerances, making it expensive and time-consuming to produce. It was complex, with numerous small parts that could be lost or damaged in field conditions. Most critically, it was temperamental, requiring careful maintenance and proving vulnerable to dirt, sand, and mud. Desert conditions in North Africa revealed these weaknesses starkly, with MG34s jamming frequently in the fine sand that infiltrated every mechanism despite careful maintenance. German armories struggled to produce sufficient weapons to meet Wehrmacht demands while maintaining quality standards. The weapon worked brilliantly when properly maintained in ideal conditions, but combat rarely provided ideal conditions. By 1942, German forces needed a machine gun that retained the MG34's firepower and flexibility, while being simpler to manufacture, more reliable in adverse conditions, and cheaper to produce in the massive quantities required by a multi-front war. The answer was the Maschinengewehr 42, or MG42, one of the most influential weapon designs of the 20th century. Dr. Werner Gruner of Grossfuss Engineering led the development team that created this weapon under intense pressure to deliver results quickly. The design brief was demanding: maintain or exceed the MG34's rate of fire, simplify manufacturing to enable mass production, improve reliability in adverse conditions, reduce production costs significantly, and maintain the universal machine gun concept that allowed one weapon to fill multiple roles. The solution Gruner's team developed was brilliant in its aggressive embrace of simplified manufacturing techniques that sacrificed appearance for function. The MG42 used stamped steel parts, wherever possible, replacing the precision-machined components of the MG34 with pressed metal pieces that could be produced quickly by less skilled workers using simpler machinery. The receiver was made from two stamped steel halves welded together, a construction method that horrified traditional gunsmiths but could be executed rapidly in facilities that lacked sophisticated machining equipment. Tolerances were deliberately loosened compared to the MG34, creating a weapon that looked crude but functioned reliably because dirt and debris had room to move through the action without causing jams. The simplified design reduced production time from 150 hours per weapon for the MG34 to just 75 hours for the MG42, effectively doubling manufacturing capacity without building additional factories. Cost per weapon dropped from 327 Reichsmarks to 250 Reichsmarks, a savings of over 20% that allowed Germany to produce more weapons with the same industrial investment. But the MG42's most distinctive characteristic was its rate of fire. An astonishing 1,200 rounds per minute that earned it the nickname Hitler's buzzsaw among Allied troops who learned to recognize its distinctive sound. The high cyclic rate was achieved through a simple modification to the bolt mechanism that increased the speed of the recoil cycle without requiring exotic materials or complex engineering. German designers understood that high rates of fire created a psychological effect beyond the purely mechanical advantage of putting more rounds downrange. The human ear cannot distinguish individual shots fired faster than about 10 rounds per second. At 1,200 rounds per minute, The MG42 fired 20 rounds per second, creating a continuous ripping sound that was instantly recognizable and deeply unsettling to soldiers hearing it for the first time. Allied troops reported that the sound alone was unnerving, a sustained scream that seemed to fill the air and made individual fire impossible to localize precisely. The high rate of fire also increased suppressive effectiveness dramatically. Suppressive fire works by creating a zone where movement draws fire so rapidly that soldiers instinctively seek cover rather than continuing to advance or return fire. The faster rounds arrive, the more effectively movement is suppressed. An MG42 firing 1,200 rounds per minute created suppressive zones that were nearly impenetrable, forcing enemy infantry to remain in cover while German troops maneuvered. British soldiers encountering MG42 fire for the first time described it as a wall of bullets, a continuous stream rather than individual shots that could be dodged or endured. The psychological impact was profound, with experienced troops who had survived Vickers and Bren fire finding MG42 fire qualitatively different and more frightening. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The weapon's design incorporated several features that enhanced its effectiveness beyond. Raw rate of fire. The barrel change system was brilliantly simple, requiring no tools and taking only seconds to complete. A trained gunner could swap barrels in 3 to 5 seconds without interrupting fire for more than the brief moment needed to unlatch the old barrel and lock in the new one. This allowed sustained fire far beyond what air-cooled barrels could normally endure, with crews carrying multiple barrels and rotating them as they heated. British weapons testers who examined captured MG42s were astonished by the barrel change mechanism's elegant simplicity. The Bren's barrel change was faster but required interrupting fire completely and took longer to complete. The Vickers didn't require barrel changes but needed constant water supply for cooling, creating logistical complications that the MG42's simple barrel rotation avoided entirely. The weapon fed from belted ammunition in 50-round or larger belts that could be linked together indefinitely, eliminating the magazine change pauses that handicapped magazine-fed weapons like the Bren. A well-trained assistant gunner could keep ammunition feeding continuously as long as supplies lasted, with the only pauses coming during barrel changes every few hundred rounds. This continuous fire capability meant a single MG42 could sustain fire rates that multiple Bren guns couldn't match because the Brens would all be changing magazines simultaneously. German doctrine exploited this advantage ruthlessly, using single MG42s to suppress entire British platoons while German infantry maneuvered against positions that couldn't return effective fire. The captured MG42 that arrived at British weapons testing facilities in December 1942 came with sand still embedded in its mechanisms and bloodstains on the bipod legs. The weapon had been taken from a destroyed German position near Tobruk, captured after fierce fighting that cost 2 British soldiers their lives and wounded 5 others. The testing team at the Small Arms School in Hythe, Kent, approached the weapon with professional curiosity, mixed with personal awareness that understanding this machine might save British lives in future engagements. What they discovered during 3 weeks of intensive testing fundamentally challenged every assumption British small arms doctrine had made about infantry firepower. The first test firing occurred on a cold morning in mid-December, with observers positioned at various distances to assess the weapon's sound signature and visual impact. The German gunner who had operated this weapon was dead, killed during the action that resulted in its capture, so British weapons specialists had only the weapon itself and captured German manuals to guide their evaluation. When the first sustained burst echoed across the range, every observer understood immediately why Allied soldiers found this weapon so psychologically devastating. The sound was unlike anything British weapons produced, a continuous tearing noise that seemed to vibrate in the chest rather than simply reaching the ears. One observer described it in his official report as the sound of fabric being ripped apart by invisible hands, continuous and aggressive in a way that made accurate return fire feel impossible. The rate of fire measurement confirmed what frontline reports had suggested. 1,200 rounds per minute, exactly double the Bren's maximum rate, and nearly triple the Vickers' sustained fire capability. But raw numbers, the testing team discovered, failed to capture the weapon's true advantage. The continuous nature of the fire, uninterrupted by magazine changes, created suppressive effects that magazine-fed weapons simply couldn't replicate. British testers set up targets representing enemy infantry positions and had soldiers attempt to move between covered positions while an MG42 fired overhead. The test was halted after the first attempt when soldiers refused to leave cover despite being ordered to move. The psychological suppression was so complete that trained soldiers, knowing intellectually they were safe, couldn't force themselves to move while the weapon fired. One sergeant, a veteran of North Africa with 2 years of combat experience, stated flatly that moving under MG42 fire felt like walking into a wall of steel, impossible to overcome through willpower alone. British weapons specialists attempted to replicate the suppressive effect using multiple Bren guns firing simultaneously to achieve equivalent volume of fire. The test required 3 Bren guns, each with a gunner and assistant managing rapid magazine changes, to approximate what a single MG42 with one assistant gunner accomplished. Even then, the effect wasn't equivalent because the Brens created pulses of fire interrupted by brief silences during magazine changes, while the MG42's belt-fed system maintained truly continuous fire. The logistical implications were staggering. A German squad with one MG42 could suppress targets that required an entire British section with 3 Bren guns to match. The German squad needed only 1 specialised weapon and 1 trained gunner, while the British section required 3 weapons, 3 gunners, 3 assistants, and coordination between multiple positions to achieve inferior results. The barrel change mechanism particularly impressed British observers, who had struggled with the Bren's more cumbersome system. The MG42's barrel could be removed and replaced in 3 seconds without tools, requiring only that the assistant gunner unlatch the barrel, withdraw it from the receiver, insert a fresh barrel, and lock it in place. British testers practiced the procedure until they could match German manual standards, achieving consistent barrel changes in under 5 seconds, even while wearing gloves. The implications for sustained fire were profound. A crew with 3 spare barrels could maintain effective fire indefinitely, rotating barrels every 200 rounds to prevent overheating. The Bren's barrel change, while faster than the Vickers water jacket maintenance, still required more time and created longer interruptions in fire than the MG42's system. Perhaps most troubling for British doctrine was the weapon's weight and portability. At 25 pounds loaded with a 50-round belt, the MG42 weighed essentially the same as the Bren, but delivered more than double the sustained fire capability. When mounted on its tripod for sustained fire missions, the complete system weighed 42 pounds, less than half the weight of a Vickers gun without ammunition or water. A 2-man German machine gun team could carry and employ a weapon delivering firepower equivalent to a 4-man British Vickers crew, and they could reposition that weapon in seconds rather than the minutes required to move a Vickers. The mobility advantage was crushing. German machine gun teams could displace rapidly when under fire, move to new positions before enemy artillery could respond, and keep pace with advancing infantry in ways Vickers crews couldn't match. British military leadership faced an uncomfortable decision as testing reports circulated through command channels in early 1943. The MG42 was demonstrably superior to British weapons in nearly every measurable category. Rate of fire, sustained fire capability, weight, portability, ease of maintenance, and psychological impact all favoured the German design. British weapons offered advantages in accuracy, particularly the Bren's remarkable precision and the Vickers' legendary reliability under prolonged fire. But accuracy mattered less in suppressive fire roles, where volume of fire determined effectiveness, and the Vickers' reliability came at the cost of weight and immobility that limited tactical flexibility. The question facing British planners was whether to attempt copying or adapting the German design, develop an entirely new weapon incorporating lessons learned from the MG42, or continue with existing weapons while modifying doctrine to compensate for firepower disadvantages. The debate that ensued revealed deep divisions within British military establishment about innovation, industrial capacity, and realistic assessment of British versus German engineering approaches. Some officers argued passionately for immediate development of a British equivalent, a belt-fed light machine gun capable of matching the MG42's rate of fire and sustained fire capability. They pointed to the casualties British infantry were suffering in engagements where German firepower superiority allowed smaller German forces to defeat larger British units through sheer volume of fire. Every week that passed without addressing this capability gap cost British lives, they argued, and national pride shouldn't prevent adopting superior enemy innovations when British soldiers were dying because of equipment deficiencies. Others contended that British industry, already stretched desperately thin, producing aircraft, ships, tanks, artillery, and countless other weapons needed for global war, couldn't absorb the disruption of transitioning to entirely new small arms production. The Bren gun production line at Enfield was operating efficiently, producing thousands of weapons monthly that soldiers trusted and understood. The Vickers, while heavy and cumbersome, was known to be supremely reliable and was already deployed in large numbers across all theatres. Introducing a new weapon would require extensive testing, development of production facilities, retraining of soldiers, creation of new maintenance procedures, and establishment of supply chains for spare parts. The timeline for such a transition would be measured in years, not months, and by the time a British equivalent entered service, the war might already be decided by other factors. A third faction argued for doctrinal adaptation rather than equipment replacement. British infantry tactics, they suggested, could be modified to concentrate Bren gunfire more effectively, creating overlapping fields of fire that approximated the suppressive capability of German machine guns through coordination rather than individual weapon capability. This approach had the advantage of requiring no new equipment development or production disruption, relying instead on improved training and tactical coordination. Critics of this approach noted that it required near-perfect execution under combat stress, assumed communications would remain intact during engagements, and still left British soldiers with inferior weapons regardless of how cleverly they were employed. The debate continued through 1943 and into 1944 without reaching definitive resolution. British industry eventually began development of new light machine gun designs incorporating lessons from the MG42, but wartime priorities and production constraints meant these weapons wouldn't enter service until after the war ended. The Bren gun remained in frontline service throughout the war, supplemented but never replaced by heavier weapons. British infantry learned to work around their firepower disadvantage through artillery support, tactical air power, and careful use of terrain that negated German machine gun advantages. But soldiers on the ground understood clearly that they were fighting with inferior small arms against an enemy whose basic infantry weapon outclassed anything Britain fielded. The human cost of this firepower disparity is difficult to quantify precisely, but was undoubtedly significant. After-action reports from Northwest Europe in 1944 and 1945 repeatedly mentioned German machine gun fire pinning down British advances, forcing infantry to take cover and wait for tank support or artillery fire to suppress German positions. Time spent pinned down under fire was time when German forces could call for reinforcements, prepare defensive positions more thoroughly, or withdraw in good order to new positions. British infantry attacking across open ground against German positions with MG42s suffered casualties that veterans described as horrific, with multiple soldiers hit during the brief seconds they were exposed while crossing open areas. Medical personnel noted that machine gun wounds tended to be multiple rather than single, with soldiers often hit by several rounds during a single burst. The MG42's high rate of fire meant that once a target was hit, additional rounds often struck before the soldier could fall or seek cover. Individual stories bring statistical abstractions into painful human focus. Private William Matthews of the Durham Light Infantry died on June 7, 1944, the day after D-Day, killed by MG42 fire, while attempting to advance across a Norman field toward German positions. His section had been ordered to assault a hedgerow defended by a single German machine gun team. The Bren gunner attempted to suppress the German position while riflemen advanced, but the Bren's magazine ran empty at the critical moment when Matthews was exposed, crossing open ground. The MG42, fed by continuous belted ammunition, never paused. Matthews was hit 7 times before reaching cover, dying within minutes despite desperate efforts by section medics. His body was recovered after the position was eventually taken with tank support 3 hours later. The German machine gun team, 2 soldiers, had held off an entire British platoon for most of an afternoon before withdrawing under armour threat. This pattern repeated across Normandy, with small German units leveraging superior firepower to inflict disproportionate casualties before retreating. Sergeant David Fraser, a Bren gunner with the Highland Light Infantry, survived the war but carried physical and psychological scars from a firefight near Cologne in July 1944. His section encountered German infantry in a village, and the ensuing engagement pitted Fraser's Bren against an MG42 in direct confrontation. Fraser described the experience decades later in oral history interviews as the most terrifying minutes of his combat service. Every time he paused to change magazines, the German gun kept firing, forcing his section to remain in cover. He could hear rounds impacting around his position continuously, a sustained hammering that never let up. When he attempted to return fire, his 30-round magazine emptied in seconds of sustained fire, requiring him to change magazines while the German gun continued uninterrupted. The psychological pressure of knowing the enemy weapon never needed to pause was overwhelming, Fraser recalled, far worse than the physical danger. His section eventually withdrew after losing 2 men killed and 4 wounded, without ever effectively suppressing the German position. Artillery fire finally silenced the MG42 an hour later, killing both German crew members. These individual tragedies accumulated into broader patterns that shaped campaign outcomes in subtle but significant ways. British advances in Normandy proceeded more slowly than planned, partly because German defensive fire, centred on MG42 positions, required extensive preparation with artillery and armour before infantry could assault with acceptable casualties. Time spent reducing each defensive position allowed German forces to establish new positions further back, creating a defence in depth that absorbed Allied momentum. American forces, attacking adjacent sectors with similar tactics, encountered the same German weapons but had developed combined arms approaches that relied less on infantry firepower and more on artillery and armour support. British doctrine, still influenced by First World War experience, emphasising infantry initiative and manoeuvre, found itself constrained by weapons that couldn't provide the suppressive fire needed for infantry to close with enemy positions under fire. The irony that British forces fought the entire war with small arms demonstrably inferior to German weapons, while British industry produced some of the war's most advanced aircraft, radar systems, and naval vessels, reflects broader tensions in British wartime production priorities and military doctrine. Britain's island geography and historical reliance on naval power meant that shipbuilding and aircraft production received priority over land weapons development. The Royal Navy needed constant production of destroyers, corvettes, and larger vessels to maintain control of Atlantic supply lines against German submarine warfare. The Royal Air Force required continuous production of fighters, bombers, and transport aircraft for operations across multiple theatres. These demands consumed industrial capacity that might otherwise have addressed small arms deficiencies. British planners made calculated decisions about resource allocation, accepting inferior infantry weapons as the price of maintaining superiority in naval and air power that they judged more critical to ultimate victory. But soldiers fighting in hedgerows of Normandy, streets of German cities, and hills of Italy didn't care about strategic resource allocation debates. They cared that their weapons were inadequate compared to enemy equipment, that they were dying because German infantry could generate firepower volumes that British infantry couldn't match. Veterans who survived the war often expressed bitter resentment that they had been sent into combat with weapons they knew were inferior. That British industrial genius that produced Spitfires and radar had failed to provide them with machine guns matching German capabilities. This sense of abandonment, of being expendable, coloured many veterans' post-war relationship with British military establishment and government. They had done their duty, despite inadequate equipment, had prevailed through courage and sacrifice rather than technological superiority, and they never forgot that their lives had been valued less than production schedules and strategic priorities determined in distant offices by men who never faced MG42 fire. The MG42's influence extended far beyond its immediate battlefield impact. After the war, the weapons design principles influenced machine gun development worldwide, with multiple nations adopting or adapting its key innovations. The United States developed the M60 machine gun, clearly influenced by MG42 design principles including belt feed, quick change barrel, and universal machine gun concept. The Belgian FN MAG, widely adopted by NATO forces and still in service globally, incorporated MG42 barrel change mechanisms and feed systems. The Soviet Union's PK machine gun family showed clear influence from captured German weapons studied after the war. Even the British eventually adopted the L7, a two-general-purpose machine gun, based on the FN MAG design that traced its lineage directly to the MG42. The weapon that had killed British soldiers during the war became the template for British machine guns for decades afterward, a final irony in a story defined by Britain's failure to match German innovation in small arms. The Bren gun, despite its wartime limitations, earned enduring respect from soldiers who used it and continued service long after its German contemporary. The weapon remained in British service until the 1990s, a 50-year service life that testified to its fundamental reliability and the difficulty of developing replacements that matched its qualities while addressing its limitations. Veterans who carried Brens spoke warmly of the weapon's accuracy, its unfailing reliability, and the confidence it inspired. The Bren was a weapon soldiers trusted absolutely, knowing it would fire when needed and hit what they aimed at. That trust had genuine value that transcended technical specifications and rate-of-fire comparisons. But veterans also acknowledged, usually with sadness rather than anger, that the Bren had been inadequate for the suppressive fire missions that dominated infantry combat, that they had fought the war with a weapon that couldn't match German capabilities in the role that mattered most. The story of British forces discovering the MG42's superiority and being unable to address that superiority throughout the war carries lessons that extend beyond specific weapons or tactical situations. It illustrates the difficulty democratic nations face in adapting military doctrine and equipment during wartime, when peacetime assumptions prove inadequate. Britain entered the war with small arms doctrine shaped by First World War experience and refined through 2 decades of peacetime development. That doctrine emphasized accuracy, reliability, and controlled fire, principles that had worked adequately in previous conflicts. When confronted with German innovation that challenged those principles, British military establishments struggled to adapt because adaptation required acknowledging that years of development had been misguided, that industrial priorities needed complete reordering, and that soldiers would continue fighting with inferior weapons while new approaches were developed and implemented. Democratic accountability made such admissions difficult. Military leaders faced questions from Parliament about why British soldiers lacked weapons matching German capabilities. Industrial planners had to justify resource allocations that prioritized aircraft and ships over infantry weapons. The pressure to maintain public confidence in British arms while acknowledging specific deficiencies created tensions that delayed honest assessment and practical response. Germany, operating under totalitarian control without public accountability, could make ruthless decisions about weapons development and production priorities, without explaining or justifying those decisions to elected representatives or informed public opinion. This created advantages in speed of decision-making and willingness to abandon failed approaches that democracies struggled to match while maintaining transparency and accountability. Yet Britain prevailed despite inferior small arms, a victory achieved through strategic advantages that outweighed tactical weapon deficiencies. British industry's focus on aircraft production provided air superiority that German ground forces couldn't overcome regardless of their individual weapons quality. The Royal Navy's control of sea lanes ensured supplies and reinforcements reached British forces, while German armies starved for fuel, ammunition, and replacements. British intelligence successes, particularly ultra-decryption of German communications, provided operational advantages that compensated for tactical equipment shortcomings. Most importantly, Britain's alliance with the United States and Soviet Union provided resources and manpower that overwhelmed German advantages in specific weapons systems. The MG42 was a superior machine gun, but Germany lost the war anyway because warfare is decided by economic capacity, strategic positioning, alliance structures, and national will, rather than individual weapon superiority. The soldiers who fought with inadequate weapons deserve remembrance, not as victims of institutional failure, though that characterization has validity, but as men who accomplished their missions despite being inadequately equipped. They adapted tactics to compensate for firepower deficiencies, used terrain and coordination to negate enemy advantages, and prevailed through courage and determination when equipment failed them. Their sacrifice ensured that lessons about weapons development, industrial priorities, and honest assessment of enemy capabilities were learned at the cost of their blood rather than national defeat. Those lessons influenced Cold War British defence policy, with post-war small arms development receiving attention and resources it had been denied during the war years. The L1A1 self-loading rifle, adopted in the 1950s, gave British infantry semi-automatic capability, matching American and Soviet weapons. The L7 machine gun, adopted in the 1960s, finally provided British forces with belt-fed automatic weapons, matching capabilities the Germans had fielded 20 years earlier. The veterans who survived carried memories of facing superior German firepower throughout their lives, memories that shaped how they viewed military service, government accountability, and the cost of unpreparedness. Many became advocates for realistic assessment of military capabilities and honest evaluation of equipment effectiveness, arguing, from personal experience, that soldiers deserved the best weapons nations could provide. Others withdrew from military affairs entirely, their wartime experience teaching them that individual soldiers were expendable resources in strategic calculations beyond their understanding or control. All of them understood that courage and determination while necessary, were insufficient substitutes for adequate equipment when facing enemies who had invested in technical superiority. That hard truth, learned in Norman hedgerows and Italian hills and German forests, remains relevant whenever nations ask soldiers to fight with resources inadequate to their missions. The German machine gunner who operated the MG42 captured near Tobruk in November 1942 never knew his weapon would be studied intensively by British specialists or that it would influence machine gun development for decades. He died defending his position, killed by British infantry who overwhelmed him through numerical superiority and tactical coordination that compensated for firepower disadvantage. His weapon, pulled from his dead hands by Sergeant Henderson and shipped to England for analysis, became a symbol of German tactical innovation and British institutional resistance to adaptation. Both the gunner and the British soldiers who killed him were casualties of decisions made by distant leaders allocating resources according to strategic priorities they considered more important than individual soldiers' lives. The MG42 was a brilliant weapon that killed thousands of Allied soldiers, but it couldn't prevent German defeat because wars are won by nations with superior resources, sustainable strategies, and alliance structures that overwhelm individual technical advantages. The soldiers who faced that weapon and died under its fire deserve memory as men who paid the price for strategic decisions beyond their control, who fought with inadequate weapons because their nation's leaders prioritized other military capabilities, and who prevailed despite those inadequacies through sacrifice that should never be forgotten or minimized. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.